I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. Back before COVID, which was like 9 years ago, it seems, elders and preachers and concerned Christians would oftentimes go into the homes of members who were maybe wayward or struggling or weak in faith. Whatever the situation may be, we would do a home visit. We would sit down at the table with them and we would talk with them about what was going on in their lives. And oftentimes those home visits were centered around family struggles. How are things at home? It's a question that would oftentimes be asked. How's your family life? And while COVID has certainly hindered some of those efforts that we as preachers or elders would make with our members, those are certainly questions that we still need to keep asking. So I'm going to ask you, how are things at home? Do you have a good marriage? Would you say that you have a good marriage? More directly, would God say that you have a good marriage? And I'm sure that there are many of you who would say, yeah, I think I have a good marriage. Some might even say, I have a great marriage. And if you would say that, then that's wonderful. Keep it up. Don't let up. Because as soon as you do, things will get bad. But I suspect that there are others here this morning who would say, no, I don't have a good marriage. In fact, my marriage stinks. I'm not happy. My spouse is not happy. Our kids are not happy, if that applies to you. And if that's what you would say this morning, can I say very quickly a couple of things to you? Number one, stop whatever it is that you're doing that's making you have a bad marriage. I'm not saying end your marriage. I'm not saying stop your marriage. Understand? But I'm saying that obviously whatever you've been doing thus far ain't working. So stop it. Both of you, stop it. We hear this all the time. You know what the definition of insanity is, right? And then we say it's doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. I understand where that's coming from, but folks, look up the word insanity. That's not what it says. I don't know why we keep saying the definition of insanity. No, it's not. Look it up. I did that last week just to make sure I was right. That's not the definition of insanity. But we understand the point, right? Whatever you've done thus far, however you treat one another thus far, has led you to this point. It's not working. So we need to stop doing that. We don't get out of the hole by continuing to dig with the shovel. But the second thing that I want to say to you is that God can fix your broken marriage. But not even God can fix it if you don't want him to. You have to want to make it better. You have to listen to what God says, and you have to implement that in your life. Because if you don't do that, then not even God can help you have a better marriage. So as I was thinking this past week about marriage and some of these ideas, I was preparing to put together a lesson titled, You Can Have a Happy Marriage. But as I started forming that lesson, it occurs. There's something else I need to talk about first. There's something else that we need to consider before we get to the how to have a happy marriage. I think it's important that we talk about this. Why does it even matter whether I have a good marriage? Why does it matter? Because there's plenty of people in this world who've been married for many years perhaps, and they're just plugging along and they're miserable, but they're still going along. They're getting through each day with their spouse, gritted teeth, but they're getting through the day. Why does it matter whether I have a good marriage? There are many people in this world who do not. There are many married people in this world who are miserable in their marriages. And they will compensate for that in different ways. They will stay late at the office because they don't want to go home. They turn to alcohol. They turn to other recreation activities that take time away from their home and their family. People compensate for being miserable in many different ways. But beloved, God did not consign us to misery. That is not what He wants for us. He wants us to have a good marriage. He expects us to have a good marriage. And He has given us help in understanding how to do it. But why does it matter? I've tried to overlook the obvious answers. Why does it matter whether I have a good marriage? Because your life's really going to stink if you don't. All right, that's an obvious answer, so I didn't include that in the sermon. But I have three other answers that I want to suggest to you that I think may help us. So let's start with this. Number one, why does it matter whether I have a good marriage? The gospel of Christ. The gospel that you believe and claim to say the world needs to hear. Our marriage reflects that. So let me show you this. Here in Ephesians chapter 5, after Paul has discussed marriage, beginning at verse 22 of this chapter, he tells us in verse 32 what he's really after. Look with me at verse 32 of Ephesians 5. He says, "This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church." So after talking about marriage and husband-wife relationship, he then comes to his conclusion and he says, actually, I'm not really talking about marriage. I am, but I'm not. Really what I'm after is to point you to the gospel. The relationship between Jesus Christ and His bride, the church. The marriage that exists between Jesus and His people. So what does Jesus do for His bride? Paul says that Christ is the head of His church. He also says that He is the Savior of His church. In verse 25, he says Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. He sacrificially loves His people. In verse 26, so that He might sanctify the church, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. He does this so that in verse 27, He might present to Himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Jesus makes His church beautiful. He sanctified her. He made her holy. He made her glorious and blameless. And in verse 29, it says that Christ nourishes and cherishes His church. This is what Jesus does for His people. Who are His people? Christians. People who have obeyed the gospel. This is what Jesus does for His people. And Paul says, husbands, you need to do all of these things for your wives. Because Christ is your model. He is your example. This is what husbands should do for their wives. Men, let me tell you, if you are married and you are not loving your wife and leading your wife in this way, then you are not being the husband that Jesus calls you to be. You are not being the husband that your wife needs you to be. But what does the church do towards Christ? Verse 24, as the church is subject to Christ, the church is in submission to him. And Paul says in verse 22 and in verse 24 that wives ought to be in subjection to their husbands, because that's how the gospel works. We join ourselves to Christ. We become his people. He is our head. He is the leader of his church, the loving, sacrificial leader for his church. And the church submits to his leadership. And Paul says, wives, you are to submit to your husband's loving, sacrificial leadership. And I know that submission is one of those words and one of those topics that we don't really like to talk about or think about. But I promise you that ladies would willingly submit to a husband who leads her in the way God calls him to. Wives, your subjection to your husband and your respect for him is a reflection of what the church gives to Christ. And so, having talked about Christ and the church and how the gospel is displayed, and having used marriage as a good illustration for that concept, Paul wraps all of this up in verse 32 by telling us what his subject really is. But notice that's not the final word on the subject. He closes by going back to marriage in verse 33. Nevertheless, in other words, I know that I've been talking about Christ and his bride. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. This is the model that God gave us. Loving, sacrificial, selfless leadership on the part of Christ towards his bride. And husbands, that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's our example. Submission on the part of the church towards her head. And that's what wives are supposed to model. This is the outworking of the gospel, but here's where I want us to really make an application. As Christians, we say to the world that they need to know Christ, that they need to hear the gospel, that they need to follow Christ. And what I'm saying to you is that if our marriage is not speaking that message to the world, then our testimony as Christians, it ain't worth much. We preach a gospel of peace and hope and reconciliation, right? But if our marriage is not peaceful, hopeful, conciliatory, then what good is our testimony about the power of the gospel if we don't even implement it in our marriage? So why does it matter if I have a good marriage? Because I'm supposed to be reflecting the gospel of Christ to the world. And my marriage is one of the ways that I do that. Number two, I need to have a good marriage because my kids need to see it. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Social scientists have known for over 100 years now that children of divorce are much more likely to get divorced themselves. There's no disputing that. There have been multiple longitudinal studies about this, tracking hundreds and thousands of people who are the children of a divorce. And researchers will watch them and see what happens in their marriages. Nicholas Wolfinger, in his book, Understanding the Divorce Cycle, said the risk of divorce is 50% higher when one spouse comes from a divorced home, and when both partners come from a divorced home, 200% more likely. Our marriage today will impact our child's marriage tomorrow. Are there exceptions? Absolutely. Don't hear me saying that if you came from a home where your parents divorced and you get married, that you will inevitably, without fail, get divorced yourself. I'm not saying that at all. But generally speaking, there are patterns that are easily discernible. But what if our children see us modeling Ephesians chapter 5 at home? What if they see what marriage ought to be in mom and dad? I want to show you a short passage. I'm going to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I could quote it, and you would know it immediately. You've heard it many times, but I want you to see it. I want you to lay your eyes on these few words because of what we're talking about this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, Paul writes and says, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ." Now, Paul's not talking about marriage in this context. I know that. But wouldn't it be wonderful if I could say to my children, son, I'm doing the best I can to follow the Lord Jesus. I'm doing the best I can to be a good, dedicated Christian. And that doesn't mean I'm perfect. That doesn't mean I never make mistakes, but it means I'm trying hard and following Christ is important to me, and I want it to be important to you. Do what I'm doing because I'm doing what he's doing. Wouldn't that be powerful? Wouldn't it be incredible if our children could say that idea, that passage applies to my dad. It applies to my mom. So can you say that to your children regarding your marriage? Shouldn't that be what we're striving for? To imitate Christ in all aspects of life, of course, but especially our marriage as we're focusing on today. I think there are some things that our kids need to see in our marriage. Let me just mention two of them. I know there's a lot, but some things our kids need to see in our marriage. Let me mention two of them. I think our children need to see affection and attention in our marriage. And all the wives are just elbowing their husband sitting right beside them. See? Give me a kiss every now and then. Yeah, that's right. Don't be afraid to display affection in front of your children. Kisses, holding hands, hugs, putting your arm around each other while you're seated on the couch watching the movie. All of those things should be common. And I know when your kids are young, like my kids are, you do those things. I mean, I come down the stairs in the morning and Stacy has got me a cup of coffee made or something. I just plant a fat one on Stacy and all the kids go, "Ah!" But I do it anyways. And I'm going to do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next day. I told myself one time, this was a long time ago, probably right around the time we first had Kinley, our oldest. I kind of made a mental note to myself, okay, when I come home from the office, the first thing I'm going to do, go kiss my wife. Not kiss the children, straight to my bride. Give her a kiss. And I tried to do that. And there are times I still do it, but most days Well, now the dog greets me at the door. And man, you talk about planting a fat one. He gets it all over, man. I mean, I'm him to me. Understand. I'm not giving it to him all over. But boy, I mean, he meets me at the door. He's excited to see me. And then followed by the children. And now Stacy kind of comes at the end. But it's the thought that counts, right? I tried. I wanted to do it. But I want my children to know Dad really loves Mom. Second thing, proper handling of disagreement. Disagreement will happen. It's inevitable. But it is important that when we disagree with our mate, that we handle that correctly. Yelling, shouting, refusing to listen, the cold shoulder, and other poor models of behavior, all that does is teach our children that this is normal in marriage. Children need to learn that disagreements can be overcome, that people can work through challenges when they arise. If we fight all the time, our children will come to believe that discord and acrimony are just the normal environment for marriage. And folks, that is not the way it's supposed to be. We can fix that. God has so much to say about communicating and handling disagreements and listening and understanding. That doesn't have to be the environment that we give them. So why does it matter whether I have a good marriage? Because my kids need to see a good marriage, because it will impact them in the future. And finally, it matters because, frankly, there are eternal implications to this. I'm going to 1 Peter chapter 3. And I'm thinking about two specific areas here of application. One of these I've considered with you before in a sermon, and so I'm not going to dwell on that one. I'm not going to linger on that one as long as I am the second. The first one, the short one. Peter says that our relationship with God is negatively affected if I disregard my spouse and their needs. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, he begins by talking to wives. He says, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior." Through the first 6 verses of the chapter, Peter says some things to the wives. But all of that revolves around this concept of submission and the respect that the wife should give to her husband. And then in verse 7, he gives instructions to the husband. Husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way. Now, after giving that instruction, the end of verse 7 is interesting. He calls husband and wife in verse 7 fellow heirs of the grace of life. And he says, if you don't do these things, your prayers will be hindered. Your prayers will be hindered if you don't follow these instructions. Now, for a long time, I saw the ending of verse 7 as only applying to the husband, because the husband is the one discussed in the most immediate context. Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way so that your prayers will not be hindered. In other words, God says to the husband, if you don't listen to your wife and honor your wife and value her opinion and listen to what she has to say and her thoughts, if you don't listen to her, then I'm not going to listen to you. when you pray. I'm not going to give you that attention. But I've come to see this warning about prayers being hindered as actually applying to the wife too, not just the husband. I think the end of verse 7 is really summarizing this whole passage. God's given instructions to wives, he's given instructions to husband, and if you ignore it, your prayers will be hindered. Surely that applies to the wife as well as the husband. Can a woman disregard what God has said about anything? Really? But can she disregard what God has said and expect her prayers to be heard? Look at Proverbs 28. Let me back that up a little bit. Proverbs 28 seems to confirm what I'm saying. Proverbs 28, look with me at verse 9. Proverbs 28, verse 9. He who turns away his ear from listening to the law, even his prayer is an abomination. So the writer there says, if you disregard what the law says, the law which came from God, by the way, if you disregard what it says, God will not listen to your prayers. Now, folks, if God is not listening to my prayers, doesn't that mean that my relationship with God is affected? Doesn't that mean that my relationship with God is non-existent, perhaps? Maybe that's an extreme word, but that sure seems to be the trajectory. I want God to hear my prayers. There are eternal implications here. Second point of application on this. Let's develop this one a little bit more. It's a related point, but nuanced. Suppose that in my spiritual and religious life, I'm doing everything right. I know, unlikely, but hypothetically, let's just say that I'm doing everything right. I worship the doctrinally correct way. I have the correct understanding on every debated point of doctrine known to man. I've figured out what nobody else has been able to figure out is what I mean there. I'm giving liberally to the work of the Lord. I worship enthusiastically. I mean, you look at my life and you say, man, if ever there was a super Christian, that guy's got it together. I'm doing all of those things right, but at home, I mistreat my spouse. I'm hateful towards her. I belittle her, talk down to her. I don't appreciate her. I constantly criticize her. Do any of those other things matter now? I mean, so what if I'm worshiping exactly the way that I'm supposed to worship? And who cares if I'm giving liberally to the work of the Lord with my money? And who cares if I'm doing all of these other things right if at home, behind closed doors, I'm a jerk? None of those other things matter. Now, understand, I'm not saying that those things don't matter, right? You understand where I'm going here. What I'm saying is, it's easy to point the finger at somebody else, Bible-believing, God-fearing man who worships up the road at XYZ denomination and say, that's not right. They're not teaching the truth on this. They're not worshiping the right way. I am, though, and I've got it all together, except that whole marriage thing. Not doing real good on that. Can I give you a verse to support this? Look with me at James chapter 2. James chapter 2. James chapter 2 and verse 10, James says, whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one, he has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. Here's James's point. The man who is an adulterer, what is he? He's an adulterer. Yes, he's a lawbreaker. That's what he is. He's a sinner. The man who commits murder, what is he? He's a lawbreaker. He's a sinner. So what if I say, that guy over there, he's an adulterer, but I'm not? And yet James says, yeah, you're not an adulterer, but you're a murderer. You may not be guilty of one, but you're guilty of something else. You're both lawbreakers. You're no better than the other guy, and he's no better than you. Because although you stumble on different points, you've both stumbled. You're lawbreakers, you're sinners. You see where I'm going with this? I may be doing everything else right in my service to the Lord, but if I mistreat my spouse, what am I? I'm a lawbreaker. I'm a sinner. And I'm no better than somebody else who may be the husband of the year. He may be the best husband on the planet, but he's missing it in some other areas of his life. We're both sinners. Now, I realize that the scenario that I gave a moment ago about the person who's just extremely conscientious about worshiping the right way and doing things according to spirit and truth, and they're conscientious about it. They're trying hard to do things the right way. I realize that the likelihood of that person going home and mistreating their spouse is not very high. I get that. But suppose I'm not as conscientious about those things. Yeah, I come to church. I fill a seat. And I sing because, well, that's what everybody else is doing. And I'll put a few dollars in the plate every now and then. And I show up just enough to keep the elders off my back. I keep up appearances, but my marriage is crumbling. You see, beloved, if Satan can cause me to disregard God's teaching in my home, then what am I? I'm a lawbreaker. I'm guilty. My relationship with God is jeopardized. My eternal destination is hell. This is serious, folks. So how are things at home? You know, you get into a group this size, you're talking to an audience like this, there's a whole spectrum. You've got some who've been married for 60 plus years and they've just got it together. I mean, they're the happiest couple. They're what everybody wants. You got others who just got married yesterday, literally. They're not here, but. And you've got people who have been through divorces. You've got people who have remarried. You've got people who are maybe on the brink of divorce. You've got people who worked through those challenges. They never got divorced. They worked through those problems and they've come out stronger on the other side. There is a wide spectrum of people in this room. I understand that. And I hope you understand, I'm not trying to say anything to hurt or to bring up emotions or anything that you don't want brought up. Please understand, that's not my aim here. And I've said this to you before, but it's worth repeating. Don't wait until it's too late to reach out for help. Too many times I have had a husband or a wife come to me when they are on the goal line of divorce and asking me to work a miracle. Folks, I can't do it. Because what it is most likely that brought you to that point, can I just be candid and frank? What's brought you to that point is stubbornness and disregarding what God has said. You've known for a long time things are not what they ought to be, but you haven't done anything about it. And you've come here and you've heard me or you've heard Joe preach on marriage, and you've heard us talk about things that have hit you square between the eyes, but you haven't done anything about it. When are you going to do it? Are you going to come to us after and say, the ink on the divorce papers is dry, now what do I do? If you hear passion in my voice, it's because there's love in my heart for you. Divorce is painful. You don't have to experience it to know it. I've been around enough of them. I've seen enough of them to know that it's not something I would wish upon anybody. So don't wait until it's too late. And you say, listen, preacher, I hear you, but I'm not coming forward right now. Not after that sermon. I don't want everybody to know what's going on. I don't want people to know about my struggles. Fine. Don't come right now. My phone number is in the directory. Call me. I'll hang around after services. I always do. We're among the last ones to leave. Hang around. Talk to me. We'll go into a room somewhere. Don't neglect the problems and expect them to go away. I need your feedback on this. I'm thinking about doing part 2 next week. You can have a happy marriage. If you're interested in hearing that, would you tell me as you make your way out the door? I'm serious. I'd like to know. I want to preach to the needs of people. And maybe you need this morning. If you do, let's do something. Let's get you the help that you need so that your marriage can be what God wants it to be. I appreciate your attention this morning. If we can help you this morning to come to Christ and obey the gospel or renew your zeal and your fervor for his service, we invite you. Please come forward now as we stand and sing.